this recording will be available, I think on Big Marker, but also on YouTube too.
So I'd like to welcome everybody to our session. I'm Lisa Dolly. I'm the director of the Mighty program at the UNC School of Education. I'd like to welcome you to Innovations in Game-Based Learning, our webinar series this semester, and really happy to have with us today Brad Mehlenbacher and our co-host Beatrix Hutton. I almost did it again. Almost added X again.
It's okay.
You're welcome to back channel chat during the talk. You're welcome to ask questions. If you notice there's a little Q&A box, you can check mark your questions. That'll pull them out in a panel where Beatrix and I can find them in case Brad misses them during your talk. And Brad, your video froze up for me again. Can you see it?
Let me check. It froze, but I can hear you all right, so I'm hoping it'll just...
Let me...
Do you want to go out and come back, Brad, just so we've got
will.
it on video? Okay, great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I hope that works.
Enrique, the tribe. Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, we're excited.
There we go.
Oh, good. Okay. Sorry.
So now I'm going to turn it over to Beatrix to introduce Brad.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. So I wanted to introduce Brad Mehlenbacher. He's the associate professor who's been teaching game-based learning at NC State for 4 years now. And he's the author of the award-winning book, Instruction Technology, Designs for Everyday Learning, and published extensively on human-computer interaction, communication design, online instruction, and emerging technologies for learning. So I'm really excited to welcome him today and hear what he has to say. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. All I need is some overheads, and I'm off to the races. Let's see. And this is the first time I've used this system, so please forgive me for look at that. That's beautiful. Life is good. The name of the talk that I'm going to be giving today, and I'm going to right now start my timer because I promised I would give lots of time for questions.
It's okay if you go over, and actually I'm going to interrupt you during your talk if any questions come up. So you'll be you can address questions during the talk. Brad, you froze up again on my video. I'm so sorry.
No. There we go.
There we go.
I hope that's okay.
There we go.
So yeah, so so which means I'm going to go through about 20 overheads relatively quickly, but I welcome questions at any point, obviously, and I was going to turn to Beatrix to help me put a couple of polls up during the talk. So anyway, let me start this off. Games and learning design, as all of you know, by the sounds of this course too, especially, is of enormous interest to educators right now and computer scientists, and is kind of the new coin of certainly the higher tech or high tech higher education environment that I find myself inhabiting. And this isn't entirely surprising, since as of 2015, a recent survey of Americans over 15 found that they spent more time playing games or using the computer for leisure as they do more time every day than they do relaxing or thinking. There's a quote for you. And again, I'm not exactly sure about the distinction between thinking and playing games that's being made there, but that note aside, I would have to agree with Huizinga, whose classic text, Homo Ludens, has him argue that ultimately we are creatures of play, and that we learn through play, and that everything, I love the quote, in its earliest phases, everything is played. Our civilization is played. It does not come from play like a baby detaching itself from the womb, but it arises in and as play and never leaves it.
Hey, Brad,
and also,
would
I'm
you
just
like
making
to
a
do
plug
that?
for a book that if you're doing game-based learning is probably should be a required read at some point. What brought me to this was I was teaching a course here called Games and Learning Design, and it's seminar-based, and we found ourselves spending an inordinate amount of time trying to do two things. First, define what we meant when we meant play, and what it is that makes games fun and traditional education, quote, not fun, and so on and so on. But also, we spent a whole bunch of time trying to figure out what genres games were, like what exactly they were as a kind of media type. And we looked, and it was a graduate course, so students helped me to go to the literature, of course, and in it we found lots of conflicting messages about what exactly, how to define game genres. And I'll just give you a few of those, but it was somewhat overwhelming initially. And this gave us an idea for a chapter that we ultimately published, or that I published with one graduate student from the course, on what we were calling expansive play and game genres. But the initial definitions were everything. They were, and this quote's a keeper: this proactive production by players of story elements of visual, motoric, auditory, decision-making symphony, and a unique, real, virtual story performs a new performance or form of art performance co-produced by players and game designers. And I'm going to take a quick sip of coffee after that sentence. It was from G's, and again, a very good book, or a very good article that ends up being a book, Why Game Studies Now. But other people got much more explicit about what they thought game genres were. So for example, Appleby goes, look, there are 4 kinds of genres for games. There are simulations, there are strategy, there are action games, and there are role-playing games. And of course, my graduate students were all fairly avid, and they are more increasingly fairly avid game players. And so they could haggle with these definitions with ease. They could say, well, how's this game that? And how does this, which one does this fall under? And this one's both. And we found the same kind of thing from McCann, who organizes their game genres around things like action, adventure, massively multiple online role-playing games, music, role-playing, simulation, sports, and strategy. And actually, I wonder if I can try this. I'm trying the poll feature, forgive me.
Do you need help with that?
I would love help with that.
Cool. Do you want the first question?
I would love that, because I was just thinking it will help me to know
Okay.
the answer to that.
Okay. It's
It's up. I see it.
That's
I see
very nice.
it, but how are you supposed to answer it? One sec. Oh, you're answering it. I can't answer it. Okay, cool. Sorry.
Oh,
I answered it.
Cool. Can
And
you
so if
see
you
the
click
results?
on the poll tab, you can see the results.
oh, okay. Oh, wow. Oh, so wow, a lot of us are doing about 10 hours a week. That's pretty awesome. Okay, I like that poll feature. That's helpful to me, because it really does. If you play games, then you can look at a list like Man's list here, and you start to go, I'm not totally comfortable describing games this way. And there are more of them. Wolf wrote a book called The Medium of the Video Game, and he lists in it, I think, 43 different types of video game genres. Everything from tabletop games to shoot 'em up games to maze games to obstacle games, or obstacle course games to pencil and paper games, and so on and so on. And of course, I spent a lot of time with graduate students just trying to categorize our games, the games we were playing. Where's Monopoly fit in that list? And so on. At the same time, we're having lots of conversations about what educators are tending to call educational or serious educational game genres. And it's also it's not entirely clear what that is either, because it starts to get added to the list. It's like there's also a game called a serious game. And what we find in the research is there's generally no consensus on what constitutes a serious game in general. And but Susie,
Would you agree? Would you agree, Brad, that an educational or serious game, though, always puts education at the front of the design? It's the main point of the design. You know, whether it's a multiplication game or a versus commercial games, which put fun at the front.
I think, yeah, actually, I love that. So that's as close in some ways that seems to me to be the best definition of them. I agree. Now, where we found it got tricky was we would look at, and I wish I'd pulled in these games as examples. If you look up a game called Loneliness online, which is free and you can play it, it strikes me as more someone doing a narrative that's meant to disturb you. It's basically you're just a dot where all the other dots on the screen move away from you as you approach them.
Wow.
Metaphorically, it's kind of, it's emulating what it might feel like to be on your own kind of thing. And so is that, I mean, could one say that's an educational game? It certainly has a clear point, but
Right.
and that's where it got muddled to us. Is it's like I would say it's a serious game, and I would say there are some educational benefits, but I'm not sure that those game developers. I'm not sure whether that was what was driving their design.
Right.
I don't know whether that answers your good question.
Hey, just your camera did freeze up again. I don't know if you want to try one more time and then we'll just leave it, but just wanted you to know.
When you have a silly face too.
There we go.
But anyway, I like that question a lot. So, and then Van Ack does a kind of condemning thing and says that such games, serious games, have dubious educational efficacy and tend to be summarized as uninteresting. And I don't agree with that. But
Chris Dees calls them the chocolate-covered broccoli.
Actually, that is very beautiful because in my second version of the course, we actually tried to design board-based board game educational games, and it is incredibly difficult to merge. That's again those two words, that sort of entertainment versus education, to merge those two things without, in a way, feeling like the game is, or the play is secondary, and you don't, of course, really want anyone to feel that. Like and the game I look at in this little talk, I hope doesn't do that, but also it could be argued that it's not absolutely clear how educators would use it. So to move off of the genre stuff fairly quickly, all I want to say is that what we discovered then is this classic paper by Carolyn Miller on game as social action, or genre as social action. And she wrote it way back in '84, and she obviously wasn't talking about games at that time. But in it, the critical phrase that she used, and it kind of created a whole field of genre studies in English literature, was she said typified rhetorical actions based on recurring situations, and which is pretty dense. But let me tell you a little more. Well, in this, I switch it, and we actually I slid a slide in there between. So we're thinking about, okay, genres of games have to do with social action. They don't have to do with game mechanics. And then we discover Engelstrom's work on expansive learning, where Engelstrom's basically saying, and the definition is dense, it's ideal, typical, expansive cycle of epistemic learning actions, which is tough. I'm going to take another sip of coffee on that. And but essentially it's any play that involves questioning, analyzing, collaboratively modeling new situations or solutions, examining models, implementing them, and then reflecting on the process. That's what we want our students to do. So we're thinking, okay, social action, games, and then we say, let's apply this to a game. And one of my students pulls out, I wish I'd actually asked this in the poll, but I suspect most of you have not heard of This War of Mine, which is a relatively intense gaming experience. Maybe I wonder if Beatrix could play the video for you.
Do we have that uploaded, Beatrix?
Look at that. It's like a minute long, but it'll give you a good sense of...
Yeah. Are we ready to go? Okay.
We
cool.
are.
Sorry about that.
No, that was fast.
War is about victory.
For Rob, it was about getting food. I lived through hell with these people. We were a group. We would do anything to stay alive. I will never forget those days. Things you see in war stay with you forever.
A kiedy przyjdziesz także po mnie, zagrawi z światła purpurowy, by mi zawebrać w ręki głowie, to będę jasny i gotowy. Spłynący wrednie dni na przestrzał, zgasną podłogi i powietrza. Na wszystko jeszcze raz popatrzę. Pójdę, nie wiem gdzie na zawsze.
I don't know if I can get my overheads again. Oh, nice. Well, so this isn't a plug for the game itself, although I thought it was fun when we were looking at games in educational journals, peer-reviewed journals. What we found was a lot of them discussions were dominated by Second Life and interestingly, the game Half-Life. A lot of studies have been done using Half-Life. So I had students I sent students out and asked them, please find games that you think are provocative or powerful and that you could imagine easily using in a course. And this was one of the games that came back. And let me switch. It's essentially it's a story of a city ravaged by war. It's 1992 to 96 city of Sarajevo, and the game focuses not on it's not a first-person shooter. Obviously, it focuses on civilian survivors of war. And the reason that the student brought the game to the class was that he saw it as teaching you about resource management and cautious reconnaissance. I haven't said the word out loud, and moral decision making. He thought it was very powerful for that. But he also had seen that players' responses to the game was to start building modding tools and translating the game for multiple languages, and especially interestingly to share their own survivor experiences from war. And so it became this kind of, again, social action around the game was what was really striking and profound in this case. And so at that point, we started to look for, well, how can we describe, we want more research on the social action rather than the game mechanics. And we stumbled upon this term, interestingly, from genre studies that was basically what are called paratexts. And the original research on this was looking at stuff like marginalia and annotations and letters about books and things like this, whereas the book was the core text. But Consalvo in 2007 does this cool thing and says, hey, we can appropriate this for more or emerging media as well, so that we can talk about things like with the games, for example, we can talk about forum discussions, guides, videos, game mods, unofficial extensions or packages associated with games. If you look, so for example, if you look up This War of Mine online, you find all of these things, and they're very, very, very active. And there are lots of different genres that spin out from just the game, including, of course, the traditional look at the YouTube playing of the game and of the version, the various mods of the game. Like there's one, This War of Mine, the Children, and so on and so on. That's received some accolades. So we spent a lot of time looking at mod forums and talking about what you'd have to learn in order to be a contributor versus a lurker and so on. And thought this was the major kind of benefit of looking at paratexts, genres, and games as social action. So with games, we started to see guides, wikis, mods, playthroughs, and so on and so on. And that we were arguing then that educators need to examine genres of paratextual development and ultimately build their own paratextual contributions. Now, one of the students in the class came up with what she called the social life of game development, and I absolutely love this graphic. And I'm going to leave it there for just a second because I'd love to ask, and maybe I can read this in the chat. If there are any, as you can see, it starts with that. Now I'm showing you how blind I am. It starts with the initial statement of the release for a game, goes through the preview of the game testing, sort of the demo beta phase, community developments where we were very interested, where a user community develops around the game, sort of a community of learners. And then third-party modifications, that's the stuff where we were seeing people doing modding and of elements and different narratives and different characters and things like this. So, and then finally the game may have official add-ons from the company as a result of this. So for example, this War of Mine, if it's my understanding that they're building different war scenarios as a result of the kind of game community. But when you look at this, does this match your experience of gameplay, and have you engaged? I would be very interested if any of you have ever, for example, built mods or contributed to game forums or constructed cheat sheets, anything, what I would call a paratext, classic paratexts of games.
I'm a beta player, so I'll put that out there. I love playing in beta and giving game feedback, and I'm also fascinated with the community development piece as well, and how not only at that stage but throughout the game, right? And because sometimes the community can go off in really bad directions, and then other times it can be a really positive thing. So I was curious if you could say more just about that piece of it and your, the social life aspect.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's lovely. And I agree with you, because I'm thinking of some of the classic texts where they talk about, for example, things like harassment in right. Multi-user domains and things like this. Is that you're right? The communities, one of the formation of rule-based behavior is sometimes fairly ugly, and that's one thing that's. And I don't think, again, this is one of those. I'm doing a paper right now on hacker spaces, and at the end of the paper, I think what aggravates me the most about all of it is that formal educators want to take what I think of as a disruptive and a radical departure from education and bring it into our environments, but we often don't. How would I put this so I don't sound accusatory? We often don't necessarily think out, as you said, some of the negative consequences of disruption, right? My daughter worked at I've forgotten the Goldman Sachs of all places, and they had in their collaborative workspace in one of them, they had a huge, she said, she took a picture of it for me, a huge disrupt sign. And I texted her and said, do me a favor and really disrupt things there and kick down the sign. And she said her coworkers didn't find that funny, but again, I mean, it's like, oh, so no, disrupt within a set of clear parameters, I suppose, is what that sign should have said, but it wouldn't have been as jazzy. But I think that's when you introduce gameplay into formal educational settings, I think you're going to get unpredictable outcomes. I find that really exciting, but
I do too. But don't you think that's part of the skill set that needs to be developed when those kind of negative behaviors happen? What are your coping skills?
I think so, and I think that's the kind of educational. Yeah, and yeah. I think in a way, I mean, again, you're anticipating my last two overheads here, because I was thinking, well, what's all this mean for educators who are thinking about taking games into the classroom? And I wrote down that list, and I think that's one of the things is that genres, these are genres that are literally emerging in real time. Like I've forgotten, there are a couple that my daughters play. Oh, where they go into forums with players of games who are well known. They're sort of famous players, and they follow them play a version of some game.
Right.
And
right.
I mean, this is not something I've read about. I've read about it when I go to online, but I haven't read in any formal publication. So how that developed and how those things look and how people expect them to look is still a work in progress. It's amazing. So, I mean, let me, keeping my promise to open up for questions. I mean, and also that was a great question. What we did was we took that general idea of the social life of game, and we applied it from our learning with looking at this war of mine. We basically applied it to Half-Life because that was the popular one that educators talked about a lot, and saw how indeed it kind of worked for it. But it was more fun for us to say, because we'd also been, it's a course on games and play in general. Somebody said, well, how about a sport? Can we take a sport that's not a virtual game? So we did that, and we looked at ice hockey. And that was a lot of fun because since I'm Canadian, I have to be an ice hockey fan. And students essentially taught me that apparently North Carolinians can be tremendous hockey fans as well, because I was unaware of all of the different levels of involvement. I'm still on I'm on the ice hockey one. I wanted to. The fantasy hockey teams, there were at least half the class was involved in fantasy hockey teams, and they were building their own kind of communities around the hockey season. So I just, this was new to me, but again, that's a kind of community involvement that I was completely unaware of, that mapped onto that general social life model. So what's all this mean for educators and this, I hope, will generate some interesting conversation, because at times I felt as though I need more data before I can say some of these things confidently. But get that aside, let me just say the game audiences, not only game experiences, encourage gamer learner engagement, participation, and collaboration surrounding game events. We know that. We should be looking at that when we think about genres as social action. That's exactly the action space where we need to look and better understand how people learn from those, how they support information communities, instructional spaces for novices, intermediates, multiple different kinds of learners work together collaboratively, which is really exciting. That community of learners notion. They give gamers a compelling and interesting space or learners actually to look at and to work within. And they facilitate all kinds of problem solving, creativity, and reflection and collaboration and so on. That is exactly what we say we want to do when we talk about effective teaching. And finally, they and this is one of the things about just looking at game genres for me that's been interesting is the terminology that comes up when you start to have to try to figure out what type of game you're looking at is, or how gameplay surrounding gameplay is teaching people things. You start to say, what do we mean by understanding and learning and motivation and knowledge, and what does deep involvement have to do with the development of expertise, and so on and so on. How much time do you have to expose yourself to a game in order to be an expert on it, which with some games it seems virtually impossible to ever reach master level. And what are the implications of that, which to me are very educational questions. And then games give us a whole new kind of forum for producing interesting learning experiences that engage students in simulations that are dynamic. And then finally, and this for me that's been the games and design course since I started teaching it, is I would wait the third time I played the course. That's great. The third time I did the course, this will be my closing sort of story, is that I decided we weren't playing enough for it to be a games course. So every night we would basically have the class for an hour, discussion for a half an hour, and then gameplay. We would play a board game, and it was each student's choice to bring that board game. And it was, did it have educational value? Was it creative? Was it fun? And so on and so on. They had a whole taxonomy that they were trying to aim at meeting. And we would play. And what struck me is I felt like it was a great class and a lot of fun, and students were really engaged. I mean, I was learning every bit as much as anybody in the room, I'm convinced. But what I saw in that last hour was a level of camaraderie and collaboration and communication and just general the stuff of effective learning spaces. Essentially, it became suddenly a relaxed, safe environment that was something like a coffee shop. And that was not in the first 2 hours of the class, because it turns out classes have a whole bunch of rule systems that good students learn how to behave within. And those aren't necessarily, those don't include swearing or interrupting another speaker or saying I disagree with the whoever's deemed the expert in the room. And I felt like the game space just immediately, automatically, it didn't matter whether it was Monopoly or not, immediately invited that. And I think as educators, that just has exciting possibilities for us. And that's why I continue to study these things. And then being an educator, I, of course, had to throw out the classic text that all of you have probably read, but that I wanted to encourage you, since the overheads are a handout. If you haven't read these texts, they're all worthwhile reads, and they give you, for me as somebody who has a background in literature, it's these all feel to me to be required reading for anybody who does game studies. So, and that's the talk. Let's see. I almost kept my promise of 30 minutes flat.
We have a couple of questions. Benjamin asks, how do you decide which games to study in your work?
Well, that's a very good question. For the course now is in its 4th version, and almost every game that I've looked at or had students looked at or have students look at has been brought to me by students. So, and some of that has been based on simple things. Like, so when we were trying to figure out what is a game, which Hudzing's thing is, what are games basically? And we would, as a class, we would write out, now we've got a definition of games. Games are X, Y, Z. And then I swear the next class, a student would bring in a game and demonstrate it and show us how it broke 3 of those rules. So one of my favorites is, and I'm forgetting the name right now, it's very popular, Flux. So games have rules. And Flux indeed has rules, but the rules change while you're playing the game. All the different versions or mods of it do the same kind of thing. Is that so? You'll start out the game with a bunch of objectives, and you're not anywhere near those objectives at the end of the game. So now we modify our definition of games again, and then sure enough, somebody brings in another game that breaks that definition, and that's where we got interested, and we need a different definition of genre. That's a long answer to a good question.
Beatrix asks, what kind of traits or types of games are well suited to the classroom? What should teachers look for when choosing a game to build into their curriculum?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm just going to say, oh, wow. That would be a good dissertation. That's always, that's
that would be a whole dissertation.
We were talking earlier about how all of this is disruptive and exciting and stuff, and it sounds a little as though we both got into, looking at the internet at a time when, my colleagues were basically saying, I was saying it's the future of reading and writing, and my colleagues were going, it's a sexy fad. And I don't think, I'm not saying they were right or wrong, and maybe it is still a sexy fad, but I think I wasn't entirely wrong. It was an exciting space for learning. So the answer to for me personally as an instructor, the answer to what type of games I would build into class would be games that made powerful statements about some content I was trying to teach about. So for example, in my summer class, this past version of the course, it was just online. It was an experiment with the course online. Somebody had said, this would be a course, I think, or this would be a game that I think everyone should play as part of this course on commercialism and education. And it was a sort of spoof on Kentucky Fried Chicken training as a game, but it was thinly veiled. So it was sort of non-corporate and critical and political in its position towards that particular institution. And that promoted a lot of really intense follow-up discussion that I don't know how any lecture I could have given or any content, any statistics I could have given about corporatization could have achieved in such a short period of time. So I go for the disruptive games. The loneliness one, when we were looking at student counseling and issues with that. Several students brought me games that were really powerful, had powerful messages about things like depression and isolation and those kinds of things. And again, who expects games to be the space where you're given powerful messages about that? But then we use that as to enliven a lot of discussion afterwards. I mean, I hope that slightly answers that question. It was a good one.
Yeah, it was a good one. And then Benjamin asked a question that maybe answers that question in a little bit. What positive outcome do you foresee bringing that game camaraderie to the classroom, or what is it yielding?
That's an interesting. I wish I could remember the classic study where they studied language use in classrooms, and it was there's a dance. It's a 3-step dance. You know, the instructor says something, the student complements it or adds to it or moves away from it or something, and then the instructor gives feedback on the student's move, and then that's the end of the circle, and then the next trifold sort of event occurs, and it plays through like that. And I guess what I saw what I saw in that last hour space of play was something that struck me as closer to the kind of informal learning that produce in deep engagement and belief systems. Like my PhD is in rhetoric, which is basically the study of how people argue and how they use arguments to inform other people's beliefs or to and so on and so on. And there are a lot of students that I speak to who say, that a lot of their belief system is not coming from their 4 years in college, and it's coming from dinner conversations. It's coming from their whatever general notions of upbringing and things like this. And that is somewhat, I find that to be something to try and undermine in higher ed. Is that, for example, we ought to have the really tough conversations in this space that help inform how people view themselves as engaged citizens and so on. But obviously I'm an idealist about that. So yeah.
Enrique asks, where do you see it going? What do you think all this research and exploration into games evolves the classroom into?
Yeah, these are good. They're very nice questions. They better get credit for these. No,
Some of these aren't my students, so
some game credit is involved. I'm hoping. Yeah, it's yeah. I just went to, and this is not a shameless plug for it. I'm just thinking of this. I went to a retirement event last night at Hunt Library at NC State, and it was the vice provost of the library was retiring, and I'd seen her over the last 30 years, kind of a stellar career, but build Hunt Library as the library of the future.
It's an amazing library. We saw it on a visit last week or a week before.
It is definitely worth a visit, and it's had actually more visitors per day for years than anyone ever imagined. And part of it is that it comes up against traditional notions. It takes some time when you enter the building to actually see a book. And there are no bookshelves proper. There's a robotic space that gets books from closed units. I mean, so even when you say that, but the traditionalist in me who grew up in libraries says, that's not a library, But what Susan Nutter, the provost of it, said was she thought the library, this was a long time ago, she said the library needed to be a space where people collaborate and see each other and move furniture and chairs. And so, for example, they have hundreds of study rooms, all with clear glass doors. They have video screens seamlessly around the building, and it's a real multimedia kind of extravaganza when you go in there. It's a little overwhelming on the initial visit, but it took her years to convince the kind of higher ed organizational units that they needed food in a library, because traditionally, historically, you didn't want food near books, but now there are food places, coffee shops, and again, if visitors and students visiting per day is any indication, this seems to be what kind of learning activities students thrive off. And I kind of see games that way as well. And I know in the library, they've got a maker space and stuff, and they've got a game emporium and things like this. And I see them as just part of that same future. And it's one, I don't think it's enough just to say, oh yeah, millennials play games, so let's make games for them in order to make ourselves relevant. I think it's rather that we know darn well 3-hour lectures aren't the optimal way to engage learners and to involve them in deep learning. We just know that. So, this is I'm not going to be a uniform advocate for gamification of education, because I mean, critical perspectives I think are still very important. But I will say that it is certainly worth investigating the implications of it for sure.
Priscilla asks, can you talk a little bit about the use of rewards and goals in game-based learning? When is it appropriate to use rewards to inspire motivation? Do you believe too much competition is bad for the learner?
That's interesting. Yeah. I'm not sure I know an answer to that. I think competition works really well for some types of learners. And some types of learners really thrive from extrinsic motivating elements in a course. Others bring to the course, and I think it's a smaller number, just a real strong intrinsic drive. But I see the problem with things like competition. I see some of that plays out, for example, in grade inflation, in simple grade inflation in higher ed. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, the average student's grade was indeed a C. And now the average student's grade is an A-. So just even getting to that point where it becomes difficult to have critical mechanisms that don't deflate learners is, I think, the real challenge to that. I mean, so I just see it as a two-sided thing. I think with some of my students, so for example, that publication that we published that chapter in Emerging Genres of New Media Environments. I was trying to remember the name of the book. And I said to the class, all of us will have our names on it, and we will agree as authors on whose name should be in what order based on who worked the hardest. That's basically it. And all of you can do it. And the chapter I published with one student. There were 9 students in the class. And that one student saw it through to the final last edit. He just stuck with it completely through. And all of the other students ultimately kind of dropped off. And he gets the ultimate reward, which is a publication out of it. It wasn't, I never set it up that way. But on the other hand, it really worked to promote the kind of work he did. It really obviously worked for him to put it in or to have it framed that way. But I don't know whether I'd recommend that instructionally for other courses, but.
Yeah. And then we have our final question, which is from Beatrix, and she says, do you have a favorite board game?
This is that's a great question. There are so many. I actually am visiting scholar at the University of Waterloo's Games Institute, and unfortunately they've got a large amount of funding, and they have board games in every conceivable space you look at. So what I'm first struck with is how little I know board games, the availability of board games. There are board games for literally every television show I can possibly, to begin with. That's just one thing. I mean, I just find it overwhelming. There are dozens of board games that are Star Trek themes of multiple, like Star Treks, not even ones that exist. So game worlds and things. So that question like that just makes me give the saddest answer, which is, I think my favorite board game is Risk, because I grew up playing that with my brother. I think my favorite board game is based purely on nostalgia and childhood memory.
That actually came up in class. We were talking about, we were calling board games we knew. And I remembered Hi-Ho Cheerio. Hi-Ho Cheerio. It was little cherries that you would put on your little tree, little plastic red cherries.
That is awesome. I mean,
I'm going to say it's still my favorite board game for the same reason.
And that's fascinating. It's funny because Louis C.K. does a small bit on playing games with his children, and he really doesn't like, I've forgotten what it is, the most popular game, Candyland. He doesn't like Candyland. It's all too happy. He says, but we have to introduce our children to Monopoly early. And then he says, and that's when we get to say tough things. It goes dark very fast. We get to say to our little 6-year-old, I'm going to take all your pieces now.
And you're going to jail.
Yeah, you're going to jail. And I'm going to use the power I've gained from you to crush your little sister. And I did think maybe that's why Monopoly isn't one of my favorites. So there've been lots of good critiques of it too. That's another thing about game studies. When you get into the pure literature studies, game studies, literature, they do some very nice critiques of classic games. And obviously our perception of geography and war and so on is pretty skewed from the game Risk. But yeah, it's interesting. I don't know whether that would be everybody's answer, whether it would automatically.
It would be an interesting survey, to find out if there is that correlation with childhood favorite games or not.
I mean, yeah, because it would be for my daughter. I've forgotten it. Neopets, was it?
Yeah.
She lived in Neopets after. That was when I first started thinking there was something to this, is that she was a good student, but she would come home and boy, she would play in the Neopets space to the point where she was doing, like she was a forum master or something. She would play in it for hours, completely uninterrupted and totally absorbed. And I thought, and I'd say, wow, I'm looking and I'm saying, wow, you're learning a lot. What are you learning about right now? And she'd say, I'm not learning, Dad, I'm having fun. And I'm thinking she's running her own forum.
She doesn't see it. She doesn't reflect on it as learning.
No, and she thinks that what happened at school, like she used to describe science as a lot of bugs. Like that was basically, it's like, well, that's probably not the only thing they were hoping you to remember, dear. But anyway.
Well, I really want to thank you for being with us, Brad. I would love to follow up with you offline for a lunch or a coffee someday.
That would be wonderful.
It would be really wonderful. And thanks to Beatrix for all your support and for our attendees for your questions and participation. We'll forward you the video. Once it's live, it'll be live in less than 24 hours.
That's both frightening and exciting.
I know, right? And just really appreciate you contributing back to the community and helping us grow. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Have a great day, everybody.
You
really
too.
appreciate you all. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.